The morning sun rose over a city littered with the massive rotting remains of a fallen beast. Kafka Hibino wiped the sweat from his brow as he stared at the mountain of intestines he had to clear. At 32, he was far from the front lines where his childhood friend was now a superstar captain. A new recruit named Rino Ichikawa joined the cleanup crew with a sharp attitude and high ambitions. Rino's presence reminded Kafka of the promise he had long ago abandoned. Their shift was interrupted when a surviving parasite kaiju lunged from the shadows of the alley. Without thinking, Kafka threw himself in front of Rino to block the creature's strike. Both men were hospitalized, barely surviving the encounter with the stray beast. Late that night, a small floating kaiju entered the room through an open window. The creature spoke a single word before diving straight into Kafka's open mouth. Kafka's body began to convulse as his bones snapped and reshaped with sickening cracks. Within seconds, the middle-aged man had vanished, replaced by a towering muscular monster. Rina woke up to see the beast and nearly screamed until he recognized Kafka's voice. They had to flee before the defense force arrived to neutralize the new threat. Kafka realized he could shift back into his human form by concentrating on his heartbeat. Despite the danger, Rino encouraged Kafka to take the defense force entrance exam one last time. The day of the physical exam arrived, and Kafka stood among teenagers half his age. He had to hide the fact that his physical strength was now backed by monstrous power. Kikoru Shinomiya, a prodigy from a legendary family, watched the clumsy old man with suspicion. During the combat phase, a high-level kaiju was released into the training zone for the cadets to neutralize. The cadets struggled as the beast's power level far exceeded the initial estimates. Kafka saw Rino get pinned under a massive slab of fallen concrete. With no one looking, he let a fraction of his monstrous strength flow into his fist. He punched the air, creating a shockwave that sent the massive kaiju flying backward. The examiners stared at their monitors, confused by the sudden spike in energy from the weak candidate. Kafka quickly reverted to his human state, panting heavily as the dust settled. Kikoru arrived at the scene, finding Kafka standing over the defeated beast. He managed to lie his way out, claiming the monster simply tripped and hit its own head. To his surprise, Kafka was accepted into the defense force as a cadet, albeit with the lowest score in history. Captain Mina Ashiro stood at the podium during the induction ceremony, her gaze cold and distant. She didn't recognize her old friend in the sea of new faces. Training began immediately, pushing Kafka's human body to its absolute breaking point. Every time he fell, he felt the monster inside him clawing to take over and finish the task. Rino stayed by his side, helping him mask his abnormal recovery speed from the medical droids. Far away in a secret facility, a mysterious humanoid kaiju watched the footage of the exam with a grin. He knew there was an interloper among the humans, and he intended to find him. Kafka sat in the mess hall, trying to blend in with the younger soldiers. Suddenly, the base's sirens wailed, signaling a massive kaiju breach within the city limits. This was Kafka's first real mission as a member of the defense force. He boarded the transport ship, his heart racing with both fear and excitement. As the ship approached the target, a massive explosion rocked the hull from beneath. Through the smoke, Kafka saw a pair of glowing eyes that didn't belong to any known monster. The internal sensors of the ship began to flatline as a high-frequency pulse hit them. Kafka felt his body reacting to the threat, his skin beginning to harden involuntarily. If he transformed now, in front of the entire squad, there would be no turning back. Kafka stood frozen as the sirens blared throughout the training grounds. The ground beneath his heavy combat boots began to vibrate with a rhythmic thud. Suddenly, a massive subterranean kaiju burst through the main hangar floor. Rino Ichikawa immediately raised his rifle and shouted for the squad to take cover. Kafka clutched his chest where the core of his power pulsed with an unnatural heat. He knew that using his human strength alone would be useless against a beast of this size. The kaiju let out a deafening roar that shattered the glass of the nearby control tower. Hoshina moved like a blur, his dual blades slicing through the monster's thick hide. Despite the vice captain's skill, the creature began to glow with a dangerous internal light. Kafka realized the beast was preparing a self-destruction sequence that would level the entire base. The defense force sensors began screaming warnings of a thermal explosion. Reno was caught in the blast radius, unable to move due to a leg injury. Kafka looked at his friends and knew he couldn't let them die for the sake of his secret. He stepped out into the open, away from the cover of the ruins. His body began to contort as the transformation took hold of his muscles. Black scales erupted through his uniform, shredding the fabric into rags. A white skull-like mask fused onto his face, hiding his human features. Kaiju number 8 stood tall, dwarfing the soldiers around him. Reno watched from the ground, his eyes wide with a mix of terror and awe. With a single leap, Kafka propelled himself into the air toward the glowing monster. He wound up a punch that crackled with immense bioelectric energy. The impact of his fist against the kaiju's core created a shockwave that cleared the fog. The enemy kaiju's energy was forced back into its own body by the sheer pressure. With a final grunt, Kafka punched through the beast, sending its remains flying across the base. Kafka panted heavily, his monstrous form steaming in the cool air. He looked down at his claws, realizing the magnitude of what he had just done. The sound of clicking safety catches on rifles echoed through the silence. Vice Captain Hoshina stood at the edge of the crater with his eyes narrowed. "Don't move, Kaiju number 8, Hoshina commanded in a voice devoid of emotion. Kafka wanted to speak, to tell them it was him, but his monster vocal cords only produced a low growl. He saw Kikoru Shinomiya watching from a distance, her face pale with shock. The transformation began to recede, but far too slowly to hide his identity. Suddenly, the sky darkened as a fleet of transport helicopters arrived. From the lead helicopter, a massive figure descended using a gravity-nullifying suit. It was Director General Isao Shinomiya, the strongest man in the defense force. Isao looked at the monster and then at the shredded uniform of a cadet lying nearby. "A monster wearing our uniform is an insult to every soldier who has died," Isao stated. Kafka fell to his knees as the final pieces of the armor dissolved, leaving him naked and vulnerable. He looked up at the Director General, his human eyes filled with a plea for understanding. Isao didn't hesitate, signaling for the containment team to move in with neural shackles. Kafka was pinned to the ground as the cold metal locked around his wrists and neck. Far away in the command room, Captain Mina Ashiro watched the live feed in stunned silence. Isao leaned down and whispered that Kafka would never see the light of day again. As Kafka was dragged toward a reinforced transport, he saw his childhood friend Mina turn away from the screen. The heavy steel doors of the transport slammed shut, plunging Kafka into total darkness. Inside the darkness, a voice that wasn't his own whispered, "Kill them all," in the back of his mind. If he couldn't convince the Director General of his humanity soon, the monster within would take over for good. Heavy iron shackles clattered against the cold stone floor of the high-security containment chamber. Director General Isao Shinomiya entered the room with footsteps that echoed like thunder against the walls. Kafka looked up through his messy hair, seeing the executioner's cold gaze staring back at him. The Director General declared that a kaiju in the ranks was a poison that had to be purged immediately. Kafka pleaded that he was still the same man who wanted to fight alongside the defense force. Without warning, Isao activated his massive gauntlets, sending a shockwave of pressure through the room. The chain snapped like paper as Kafka was forced to transform into his monstrous state to survive the impact. Kaiju number 8 stood tall once more, his skull-like mask gleaming under the stadium lights. Isao launched forward with speed that defied his age, striking the monster with a sonic boom. Kafka skidded backward across the ground, his feet carving deep trenches into the solid reinforced floor. He knew he couldn't just defend, he had to prove he could control the beast's instinct to kill. The Director General unleashed a barrage of strikes that felt like artillery shells hitting home. Blood, dark and thick, sprayed from Kafka's shoulder as the armor cracked under the pressure. Aizawa reminded him that a monster's only destiny is to be dissected on a laboratory table. Inside his mind, Kafka fought the urge to let the monster's core take full command of his senses. He remembered Mina's back as she led the troops, and the promise they made to stand together. With a roar that shook the entire facility, Kaiju number 8 caught the director's next punch with one hand. Aizawa's eyes widened as he felt the sheer raw strength of a being that refused to submit. Kafka didn't strike back with lethal force, but instead pushed the director away with a controlled burst of energy. The transformation began to flicker, showing the human man trapped within the terrifying shell. Aizawa prepared for one final devastating blow to end the conflict once and for all. Kafka stood his ground, choosing not to dodge or counterattack the man who held his fate. The massive fist stopped just inches from Kafka's exposed human face, the wind pressure blowing his hair back. Silence descended upon the arena as the dust slowly settled around the two combatants. The Director General asked why the monster didn't strike when he had the chance to kill. Kafka replied that he couldn't kill the man who built the force he so desperately wanted to join. Aizawa looked at the destruction, and then at the broken man who refused to be a monster. He decided that while Kafka was a weapon of mass destruction, he was a weapon that could be aimed. The high alert sirens finally ceased their wailing, replaced by the sound of medical teams rushing in. Kafka fell onto his back, staring up at the distant ceiling, a small smile appearing on his lips. From the observation deck, Captain Mina Ashiro watched the scene with a rare look of pride. She whispered that he had finally made it back to the starting line. Word spread through the barracks that the monster was actually one of their own. Reino Ichikawa cheered from his hospital bed, knowing his friend had survived the impossible. The Defense Force officially designated Kafka as a living weapon under the direct supervision of the 1st Division. No longer hiding in the shadows, Kafka walked out of the containment unit with a new sense of purpose. He knew the path ahead would be filled with even greater monsters and harder choices. But as long as he had his heart, he would never become the disaster everyone feared. The legacy of Kaiju number 8 was no longer a story of terror, but a story of a man who refused to give up on his dreams. Kafka Hibino was no longer just a cleanup worker, he was the ultimate shield for humanity. Together, the Defense Force and their secret weapon stood ready to face whatever darkness emerged next from the Earth.